Between 1993 and 1996, the hip-hop coming out of New York City and the East Coast ended up being such an important part of hip-hop history, and many hip-hop historians call this era the East Coast Renaissance. The era unfortunately ended in about 1997 due to the mass commercialization of hip-hop, and even though the late 90s were a dark time for East Coast and New York hip-hop, the dissolution of New York's Renaissance led to some interesting offshoots. Time to explore life in East Coast hip-hop post-Renaissance. So this is the fourth and final part of my video series on the Renaissance. In part 1, I covered the importance of 1993 and 1994. Part 2 included my analysis of what I believe to be the most important year for the Renaissance, 1995. In part 3, I took a look at 1996 and the East Coast-West Coast feud, as well as the emergence of Bad Boy Records, which effectively killed the Renaissance. Here in part 4, I'm going to speak about life after death within New York hip-hop and beyond. There were actually some very interesting results that came as a part of the Renaissance's demise, and there was even another smaller resurgence at the end of the decade. A big characteristic of the latter parts of the Renaissance was the East Coast and West Coast War. While it was primarily between Tupac and the Notorious B.I.G., other artists got dragged into it such as Mobb Deep, Nas, and Chino XL. This feud unfortunately ended in the slayings of Tupac and Biggie within 6 months of each other, and all of the sudden hip-hop was a bit directionless, and in 1997, simply put, it just wasn't the best year for New York and East Coast hip-hop. Capitalizing off the exposure gained by the bi-coastal feud and the death of their marquee artist, Bad Boy Records quickly kicked off the shiny suit era in the Mo Money Mo Problems video, and quickly and severely watered down East Coast hip-hop in 1997. By the end of 1997, the underground faction that had been around for years and had taken cues from the Wu-Tang Clan, who had released their triumphant double album Wu-Tang Forever in the summer of '97, really began to gain steam. And this was one of those few but key positive side effects from the Renaissance's end. At the same time, there were artists holding on to the gritty, hardcore, boom-bap styles that defined the Renaissance. And one of the most notable examples of an artist still putting out hardcore music post-Shiny Suit era was from the Queensbridge duo Capone and Noriega, who put out one of the grittiest albums of the entire decade as the Renaissance was ending. The War Report was released a few months after the Shiny Suit era began, coming out in June of 1997, and apparently the War Report was recorded throughout 1995 and 1996. The duo consists of both Noriega and Capone, the latter of which was supposedly incarcerated when the album was being recorded, which may have led to the delays in its release. Case in point, the album's 15th track, LA LA, was released in April of 1996, more than a year before the album's release, and was a direct response to Death Row Records' disrespect of New York. I covered in part 3 about how the East Coast-West Coast feud really took off in 1995 after the Source Awards held in New York, and not long after that, the Dog Pound released a video for a song titled New York, New York, which featured giant versions of Snoop Dogg and the Dog Pound stomping on Manhattan skyscrapers just as the feud was heating up. While the majority of the East Coast actually ignored this and didn't want any smoke with Death Row Records, Capone and Noriega, Mobb Deep, and Tragedy Khadafi got together with former Juice Crew member, Golden Age veteran, and Queensbridge native producer Marley Marl, and the group responded in the form of LA LA. Speaking of Tragedy Khadafi, who was another former Juice Crew veteran and Queensbridge native, he is very present throughout the War Report, providing excellent wisdom and abstract, streetwise lyrics that nicely complemented the styles of both Capone and Noriega. Tragedy appears on about half of the album's tracks and drops a legendary verse on the album's lead single Tony, which was a majestic, flowing song with mafioso tendencies and a lot of East Coast pride. And while this song and songs like Live On, Live Long were almost accessible radio-friendly joints, the album was extremely hardcore, dusty, and gritty, especially for an album released in 1997. So as a result, it sounded much harder than anything else coming out at the time. And of course, once again, this was due to the fact that the recording process dated all the way back to 1995 in some cases, and a lot of this album was actually made while the Renaissance was still in full swing. But due to some of those logistical delays in the album's release, it serves, in my mind, as the last album with true core Renaissance values and sounds. The beats on the songs Bloody Money and Halfway Thugs, the latter of which was actually a diss track aimed at Prodigy from Noriega, as the two had a personal conflict at the time, are just quintessential examples of the Renaissance sound. Both have extremely hard, dusty, crisp drums that are delivered over menacing melodic piano loops. Other songs like the extremely dark, violent, and menacing Stick You, the abstract, serious street cut Iraq See the World, and Never Die Alone, which I think is one one of the darkest songs of the entire Renaissance, are punctuated by more upbeat but still hardcore songs like Driver's Seat, Thug Paradise, and Illegal Life. The production job on here just gives off a perfect mid-90s Tim stomping aesthetic, with contributions from Havoc, Easy LP, Buck Wild, Lord Finesse, and Marley Marl. I think The War Report is an album that actually does get enough love with deeper hip-hop heads, but overall, I don't think it's talked about enough as one of the most important albums of New York's Renaissance. I even named it the #1 most underrated 90s hip-hop album. Go check out my video that I'll link up in the corner. But The War Report was not by any means the only hardcore album from 1997, though it is, in my opinion, the hardest from that year. DITC's OC dropped his second album, Jules, in August 1997, and while OC was a little bit more calculated and abstract in his rhymes, the beats screamed late Renaissance and featured generous contributions from DJ Premier, who was one of the producers that left the biggest imprint on the Renaissance. After effectively taking the Renaissance off and stepping away from hip-hop for about 5 years, Rakim re-emerged in November of 1997 with his excellent debut, The 18th Letter. East Coast hip-hop was really hurting by this time, so having one of the greats back in the game was really the shot in the arm that East Coast hip-hop needed. Other acts like Newark, New Jersey's Artifacts returned in the spring of 1997 with their follow-up album, That's Them, which in my eyes is an extremely underrated late Renaissance gem. Killa Army, which was a group under the Wu-Tang umbrella, dropped their hard-as-nails debut, Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars, in the middle of 1997. And other artists like the newly emerging Royal Flush dropped a decidedly hardcore debut with mafioso themes entitled Ghetto Millionaire, also in the middle of 1997. So yeah, 1997 was the year that East Coast hip-hop really went mainstream in a very painful way. There's a lot of artists that kind of towed the line between mainstream and hardcore. A great example of this was Busta Rhymes, and in September 97 he released his second album, When Disaster Strikes. The Beatnuts, which were an underground Queens group that made some noise during the early part of the Renaissance, came back in June 97 with their second full-length album, entitled Stone Crazy, which featured the radio banger Off the Books, which introduced Big Pun to a widespread audience. Bronx duo Camp Lo dropped an incredible debut in Uptown Saturday Night, which was a slang-laden, loosely mafioso-themed album, and it came out in January of 1997. While Uptown Saturday Night was at heart more of an underground album, there was a lot of glitz and glamour here, particularly on the album's lead singles, Lucchini and Coolie High. The album was extremely abstract and made deep cultural references, including a heavy nod to the blaxploitation era of film in the 70s. But possibly the biggest result of the watering down of East Coast hip-hop was the underground factions that emerged. Sometimes referred to as the backpacker scene, this was a quickly and furiously emerging offshoot that didn't even have an ounce of mainstream appeal and touted the preservation of real hip-hop. This was punctuated by battle raps, hardcore, crisp drums, and forward-thinking samples which were directly influenced by the core elements of the Renaissance, which in this case weren't really altered too much from their original formula. Raucous Records was one of the first important underground record labels, and through their Sound Bombing and Lyricist Lounge mixtape series, they were arguably the earliest and most influential underground label out of New York. They housed artists such as Company Flow, whose 1997 debut Fun Crusher Plus is one of the most important underground post-Renaissance New York hip-hop records. The album features strange, spacey production from LP and abstract rhymes from LP, Big Juss, and Mr. Len. Raucous was also the home of the duo Black Star, which consisted of Talib Kweli and Mos Def, two guys that are household names today but were emerging underground artists in the late 90s. Their debut album, Mos Def and Talib Kweli Are Black Star, was an absolute breath of fresh air among the shiny suits. Released in 1998, this remains one of the finest and most celebrated New York hip-hop albums of all time, coming at a very unlikely time. Other artists like Kool Keith, Organized Confusion, and KRS-One released important albums in 1997 to keep the underground spirit alive. And while New York was where the Renaissance started and ended, the influence of what took place within the 5 boroughs was quickly spreading to other cities as a lot of regional underground scenes began to emerge. Philadelphia had a quickly growing scene, and while the Roots had received some mainstream attention by the end of the decade, artists like Jedi Mind Tricks, Bahamadia, and the Army of the Pharaohs collective were also emerging. A group by the name of Mood out of Cincinnati, Ohio, dropped a classic boom bap album entitled Doom in 1997. Common had been representing Chicago since the end of the Golden Age, but was starting to gain a real following in the wake of his jazzy, excellent album Resurrection in 1994, which sounds very much like an East Coast Renaissance album. In 1997, his album One Day It'll All Make Sense was a major bright spot in hip-hop's underground. Detroit's Slum Village, which featured Jay Dilla as one of the group's core members, emerged with their debut album, which is criminally slept on these days. Minneapolis, Minnesota saw the emergence of the duo Atmosphere and their debut album Overcast. The duo had just established Rhyme Sayers Entertainment, which was a very important underground label, based right there in Minneapolis that drove a very robust scene through the 2000s. I already spoke about how there were some real quality albums still coming out of New York in 1997 and 1998, but by the end of the decade, there was another mini-emergence of newer, more hardcore hardcore artists that were clearly inspired by and came up on Renaissance music. Most notable was DMX and the Rough Riders crew from Yonkers. DMX had a very busy 1998 and dropped two formidable records, It's Dark and Hell is Hot and Flesh of My Flesh, Blood of My Blood. It's Dark and Hell is Hot has aged incredibly and is probably one of the strongest records from the late 90s. The Lox, who were ironically signed to Bad Boy Records, put out their debut album Money, Power, Respect in 1998, which was decidedly hardcore and really helped Jadakiss and Styles P position themselves for success as the 2000s began. Fat Joe was part of the DITC crew and emerged in the Renaissance as a lyrical force to be reckoned with, and he dropped a fairly hardcore album in Don Cartagena in 1998, though it did have a strong mafioso theme and also had mainstream tendencies. At that time, he had a close relationship with another emerging rapper, Big Pun, who burst onto the scene in 1998 with his now classic debut Capital Punishment, which was pretty much at the center of what I consider to be this mini-resurgence of New York hip-hop in the late 90s. AZ came out with his second album, Pieces of a Man, which I believe is a bit underrated. And if you remember, AZ was one of the earlier artists to embrace the mafioso style back in 1995 with Do or Die. So while there was a smaller, secondary, hardcore resurgence that knocked on the door of the mainstream, there were also more conscious artists that dropped excellent records that also made forays into the mainstream. In part 3, I talked about The Score by Fugees, who kind of unofficially broke up in 1997 or 1998, which allowed Lauryn Hill to release her historic debut, The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill, which remains one of the most influential albums of all time. The album won 5 Grammy Awards in early 1999 and had a similar appeal to The Score by Fugees, as she offered her crossover neo-soul approach. This was mixed beautifully with conscious hip-hop and some reggae influences. Other acts like the Beastie Boys with Hello Nasty had resurgences of their own in 1998, as did Gang Starr with Moment of Truth. Pete Rock came back that year with an excellent compilation album, Soul Survivor. The Wu-Tang Clan, which was basking in their success of Wu-Tang Forever, helped put out some strong records from Wu-Tang affiliates, including Killah Priest, Capadonna, and Sons of Man. M.O.P. had a great album in First Family for Life, and Kool G Rap followed up his Renaissance classic 456 with his second album, Roots of Evil. Onyx also came back with a mid-career classic in Shut 'Em Down. And some of this momentum continued into 1999, which was headlined by Mos Def's seminal debut album, Black on Both Sides. Mobb Deep came back with a hardcore effort for the new millennium in Murder Music, and Redman and Method Man teamed up for a fun, energetic album in Blackout, which featured the massive single, The Rockwilder. Pharoah Monch held it down for the underground with his debut, Internal Affairs, which featured the crossover smash hit Simon Says, and Raucous Records pumped out the second installment of their Sound Bombing compilation that year as well. So in New York, 1998 and 1999 actually had a ton of bright spots. But let's be honest, that late 90s period just didn't feel as authentic and special as what happened in the mid-90s. But what it did show is that the real, true artistry of hip-hop wasn't going anywhere. If it could survive the shiny suit era, it could undoubtedly survive anything. Now, of course, hip-hop acting as a business came as a massive trend as the 2000s unfolded. And you could probably blame Bad Boy Records for this, though at the same time, if Bad Boy didn't come in and do it, somebody else would have. It was just inevitable at that point. And just like that, the Renaissance came and it went. That roughly 4-year period brought us some of the most important and revolutionary hip-hop of all time, and it changed its landscape forever. Enter the Wu-Tang, Illmatic, Ready to Die, the infamous, Only Built for Cuban Links, and Reasonable Doubt, among others, are often in the discussion for the best hip-hop albums of all time. If you recall, the Renaissance started kind of as a response to the West Coast stealing New York's thunder all the way back in the early 90s. And by the time it was over, it was a lifestyle, it was a cultural phenomenon that was as unique as they come. And while Renaissance-era hip-hop really did evolve as a style during the mid-90s, let's be honest, it did have its flaws. To me, the most obvious thing, and this can really be applied to any era of hip-hop leading up until about the mid-2010s, is that the era was overwhelmingly male-dominated. Simply put, there were a lack of female voices, and again, this is a problem for hip-hop in general. The Renaissance did see names like Foxy Brown and Lil' Kim emerge, along with other names, of course, like Lauryn Hill, and then there was Bahamadia on the underground side of things. The Golden Age even had Queen Latifah, Salt and Peppa, and MC Lyte. And while there are more female rappers from both eras that I could also mention, there's just no way around the fact that hip-hop prior to about 2015 was just overwhelmingly male-dominated. Even today, the majority of artists are still male, though progress is being made. In addition, it can be hard to hear some of the transgressive misogyny and homophobia in some of the lyrics from Renaissance-era hip-hop. Now look, times have changed, it was a different era, but that still doesn't keep me from cringing when I hear these antiquated things, if you will. There's also an illusion conclusion that Renaissance era hip-hop was glorifying violence, and of course this, again, is not specific to the Renaissance. And yes, the lyrical content was as violent and unfiltered as it had ever been in hip-hop to that point. But there's one key word I use there, and that's unfiltered. The Renaissance was a special era because it was the first time that it was standard for artists to really truly report on their surroundings. They said exactly what was on their mind, and of course the majority, if not all of these Renaissance artists had a terrible, awful upbringing in the inner city of New York and other East Coast locations. And to me, it's not really a glorification of guns and violence, it's more of the street journalism and reporting that I had mentioned in previous parts of this video series. The everyday reality and surroundings for these artists was dark, violent, and sad. And you got exactly that in the music. You might look at the boot camp clique Smith & Wesson and think they're glorifying guns. I mean, perhaps there's a little bit of that in their name, but this was the reality the aptly named Tech and Steel most likely came up in and were existing in when they broke out as artists. And while a lot of people have turned their noses up at violence in hip-hop from any era in the past, when it comes to the Renaissance, these were essentially lifestyles that were being recorded onto tapes and CDs. This was the everyday existence of so many people in the inner city that either had to work menial jobs due to lack of access to education or literally participate in crime to make ends meet. Society has always marginalized African Americans and Latinos, and while some progress has been made in recent decades, the 90s were certainly no exception to this rule. When you're effectively treated like animals, confined to ghettos, and swept under the rug by white society, these are the results. Any privileged person that fails to see why the inner city was a breeding ground for violence and illegal activity needs to re-examine their view of the world. And in the case of New York City's hip-hop renaissance, the most talented and sometimes most traumatized storytellers emerged with this pure, emotional, heartfelt music that was more of a snapshot of reality than pretty much any other type of music that had ever existed to that point. So when you listen to Renaissance-era hip-hop, I want you to remember this. When you listen to this amazing era of hip-hop music, I want you to remember the sadness, the pure emotion, the despair, and the nihilism. Remember the great albums, but also remember the troubling moments that haven't aged so well. Because these things are, when put together, the definition of New York City's hip-hop renaissance, a legendary period between 1993 and 1996 that not only redefined hip-hop, but music as a whole. We were lucky to get the Renaissance in the first place, even if it did end in a sterile, polished, sparkling, cash-grabbing whimper. Let's not let the sad end of an era define what was given to us. This is truly one of the most special times in hip-hop history, and it is an important part of New York City's cultural history as well. I'm just thankful that we got so much great output, as it has changed my life as a music listener, and it will continue to be one of the most valuable sonic assets that I will have in my life until the day I die.